We're back with our tech lead now and a closer look at how TikTok may be manipulating what you and your family and your kids see online. It's an issue at the center of a hearing being held tonight by the Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the U.S. and China, and we're joined by the chairman of that committee right now, Republican Congressman Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin. Mr. Chairman, thanks for joining us. What has your committee discovered in terms of how the Chinese government might use TikTok to control the flow of information?
Well, first of all, Jake, I want to say the analysis that you did in the previous segment was very important. And for TikTok to dispute the methodology does not make much sense because in mid-November, they were the ones who proposed this very methodology and pointed people to use these very same data of posts tied to hashtags. So it's simply using the methodology that TikTok themselves highlighted, and you start to see these anomalies, why there are certain differences between Instagram and TikTok that don't make much sense. There could, of course, be an endogenous variable confounding the data, but right now we don't have an explanation for the anomaly, and I just found TikTok's response warranted further investigation. We're hoping to get into that tonight, but also tease out the connections between TikTok, their parent company, ByteDance, that owns them, and of course the connections between ByteDance and the Chinese Communist Party. And we have clear evidence that ByteDance has done the Chinese Communist Party's bidding. They shut down a news platform when the CCP said it failed to follow appropriate political direction. The head of ByteDance was forced to issue a groveling apology to the CCP and vowed that future product lines would follow appropriate Socialist Party direction. So clearly there is an intimate relationship between ByteDance and the CCP, which raises the question of whether we want to allow a platform like TikTok to be the dominant news platform in America. That's the bipartisan concern we have on the committee.
And it's not just about allegedly suppressing news related to China, such as Tibet or Hong Kong, which I didn't even mention in that segment. But some supporters of Israel have suggested that TikTok is not only promoting anti-Israel sentiment, but just outright anti-Semitism, which also would feed into the Chinese government's anti-Western goals. Is there evidence of that you've seen?
Well, if you just look at the data, there's about 50 to 1 skew in terms of pro-Palestinian versus pro-Israel content. Even if you just account for younger voters who might have a more pro-Palestinian skew or be less enthusiastic about supporting Israel, people under the age of 30, it doesn't align with what we know about basic polling data. So there is that. There's also a difference if you try to do that apples to apples comparison between Instagram and TikTok in this case. It's about a 5 to 1 post difference for Instagram and TikTok, whereas the average is usually 2 to 1 or in a band between 1 to 1 and 3.2 to 1. So again, you have these anomalies that don't seem to make sense unless there's some other variable that TikTok can come up with. And again, I just want to stress, all that is using the metrics, the goalposts that TikTok themselves put out in November when they started to get asked questions about anti-Semitism, which is rampant on their platform. And of course, there were particularly acute cases like people sharing Osama bin Laden's letters to America and praising the content therein.
Right, and of course we should point out there's a big difference between criticizing Israel or being pro-Palestinian and being anti-Semitic, which is, those are three different things. You've described TikTok as digital fentanyl, and we know social media can be addicting, and look, TikTok is addicting. It's a great app, but TikTok in particular, because it is such a well-done app, it's very popular, especially among younger Americans. And I just wonder, can the genie even be put back into the bottle?
I think so. I think we can legislate a responsible solution to this issue of social media apps that are controlled by foreign adversaries or countries of common concern, and pair that with a positive framework for how we regulate cross-border data flows, which right now is the Wild West, and we don't really have any regulatory process. To me, that's eminently possible. We're working on such legislation right now on the Hill, but and while I grant that social media in general is a cesspool and it has adverse impacts on kids under the age of 30 in particular, the problem with TikTok, really the unique problem with TikTok, is its basic ownership structure, right? It is owned by ByteDance, which is beholden to the Chinese Communist Party. And even if you hate Facebook or you hate Instagram or you hate whatever social media company in America, the same thing is not true of those companies. So that is the core of the issue, as well as all the reports we've had about how data might be being used. And then again, just the basic point that TikTok is increasingly a news platform for young Americans. It's not just about the data, it's not just about the spying or the espionage, it's whether we want to allow it to become the dominant news platform in America. And I think that's a risk we can't take.
Yeah, and of course the Chinese are quite different with what their kids see on their version of TikTok. Much more educational, much more controlled, much more limited in terms of how much screen time they let their kids have. Before you go, I got to ask, are you going to vote to expel George Santos tomorrow?
Right now I'm a lean no, just because of the precedential concerns. I'm admittedly working through the entire ethics report right now. This would be unprecedented for someone who hasn't been convicted. Clearly he should have resigned, however. That would have been the right thing to do. It does not look like he's going to do that. I'm glad he's not running for re-election. He should not be a member of Congress. So I have to balance that against the new precedent we're setting here, which I fear, based on evidence we have from all these other things where we've broken precedent, it will ultimately be used, it will escalate, and both parties will just start to try and kick members out for things that are less severe than the ethical implications or the ethical crimes of George Santos.
All right, Chairman Mike Gallagher, thanks so much. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you.